This is a short introduction to Theosophy. Now, this is something you should watch after you've seen the video on Gnosticism. So if you haven't seen that yet, go back and watch that one and then come to this one. But let's just jump in here. Theosophy was a philosophical movement, philosophical religious movement, founded toward the end of the 19th century by Helena Blavatsky and Henry Olcott. And it's going to have in it some of the threads, the thoughts, the sort of the breadcrumb trails of Gnosticism, which is why you need sort of that in your head first. Now, Blavatsky and Olcott were enamored with Indian culture, speaking there of ancient India, not Native Americans, but India. They were enamored with ancient Indian culture and the intellectual debate over the origin of the Aryan race, which was really hot at the end of the 19th century. The Aryans were presumably the high cultural, in terms of antiquity, the high cultural race that settled in India in great antiquity, as opposed to some of the other races that you could find evidence for in ancient India, lesser races. Blavatsky is going to really be obsessed with this whole idea of race, in some cases as we think of it, and in other cases, quite differently than we think of it. But again, she was enamored with Aryan origins. Again, if you put yourself back in the age of discovery, when people are getting in ships and going to North America, they're going to ships and going to India and China. They're Europeans. Okay, they're discovering new civilizations, new peoples, and new texts, new writing, forms of writing, literature. And one of those in ancient India were the Vedic scriptures. And they had a completely different version of how humanity was created and what was going on in great antiquity as opposed to the Bible. And by the end of the 19th century, this is the late 1800s, this is in the wake of Darwin. And so the Judeo-Christian way of looking at human origins was sort of on the downside, sort of on the way out, or at least in the crosshairs. People didn't like it. And when these texts were discovered and deciphered, Sanskrit being an Indo-European language, again, that was exciting because it gave scholars this notion that, look, we actually have an alternative origins account here. And because of their language, it's Indo-European. It's the same language family as Greek and Latin and, of course, English and the Romance languages of Europe, that we have some sort of heritage that we share with whatever the high culture was that produced this literature in remote antiquity in this place. So many people were primed to get rid of the awful Jewish version of origins in the Bible, that it was wrong, it was false, and Darwin had undid it, or had undone it, I should say, correct my grammar. Darwin had undone it. He had dispensed with it. And the intellectual climate of Europe, it was just ripe for this sort of thing. And Blavatsky and Olcott were two that just seized on the debate and really sort of went to town with it and created an alternative mythology that built upon the whole Aryan question. But it was much bigger than the Aryan question, because you have to determine, well, where did the Aryans come from? And so this is what they invented. Now, Blavatsky taught that humanity had descended or evolved from a series of 7 root races, was her term. And she called this anthropogenesis, again, the beginning of humanity. Now, the races she's taught, and these span millions of years, okay? And some of them aren't even true humans. It's only toward the end that you start to get true humans. So she has non-human races that are involved in this picture. Okay, so just store that away for a moment. As the races move on, you go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, all the way down to 7. They descend in spiritual nature. That is, they get worse spiritually. They get less enlightened. Okay. The 5th root race was where she put the Aryan race. And this race produced 7 what she called under races, which included the people of India and, surprise, surprise, the Teutonic peoples. Yes, you've heard the term Aryan race in connection with the Nazis and the old Norse thinking, the Teutonic. Again, the certain of the Germans the Nazi, the master race idea believed that the elite among them descended from the Teutonic people, the Scandinavians, the whole blonde-haired, blue-eyed thing. This actually, that mythology that Hitler is infamous for, has components that come from Theosophy. Theosophy is not the only source of what Hitler was thinking, but it's an important one. Now, the fifth root race, according to Blavatsky, has been around about 1,000,000 years, and it's soon going to expire. Now, she was writing this in the 19th century, so she said, hey, we're here in the 19th century, we see the handwriting on the wall. This race is going to pass away, and it needs to be superseded by a master race, by another race, a race that's better. We need to stop this downward spiritual trek, and we need to do something to, again, produce a new enlightened race, to sort of an upswing in the evolution instead of a downswing. Now, she believed that the Aryans ultimately came geographically from the north. This is another component, again, of Aryan mythology and ultimately Nordic and Teutonic and Nazi occultish mythology. Again, they're not all the same thing. They're not all synonyms for each other. It's just that they each have certain ideas in common. Blavatsky also believed that the Aryans descended from the previous race, the fourth root race, which she called the Atlanteans. Oh yes, here we go with Atlantis. She said Atlantis was the first truly human race, but it was, of course, advanced. It was more advanced spiritually because it preceded the fifth root race. The Atlanteans, of course, lived in this place that Plato called Atlantis. Now the Atlanteans had come from the Lemurians. If you're familiar at all with lost continent mythology, the Lemurians are going to be a familiar term. They were the third root race. They were black. They coexisted with dinosaurs, but they were not like modern humans. The Lemurians, in turn, previously had descended from the Hyperboreans. It's another term that you might be familiar with, again, with lost continent mythology. The Hyperboreans were the second root race. I should say you'd be familiar with these terms too if you were familiar with Edgar Rice Burroughs and science fiction, and again this sort of alternative history kind of stuff that you see that's part of science fiction but also separable from science fiction. A lot of it's theosophy. Now the Hyperboreans lived in what is now Greenland or Iceland or Scandinavia, so there we get the north connection. But these places were tropical in their time. This was before the Earth was tilted on an axis. That's going to be caused by a great catastrophe. So if you're familiar with catastrophism, again, the whole mythology of catastrophism, again, part of that is theosophical as well. Now the ultimate first root race, which Blavatsky calls the Fathers, and the Aryan word, the Sanskrit word, is the Pitris. These were spirit beings. And according to her, they were composed of etheric matter. They were made of something, but it wasn't like material like we know of it. And they were from the moon. And they themselves were preceded by other space beings. They reproduced like amoeba. The Earth was still cooling at this time. Again, this is the early stages of Earth. It's not yet habitable. And when Earth becomes habitable, when ground comes up from this primeval soupy mess, Blavatsky called that Mount Meru. That was the primeval mound. You realize what she has here. She has humans ultimately coming from extraterrestrials. Okay, so you can see again how easy it is for modern science fiction and how easy it's been to connect, these dots. I mean, frankly, the UFO contactee literature would be almost nothing without theosophy. Ancient astronaut theory, contactee literature really comes from things like theosophy and Gnosticism, and also horror writers of the same period, late 19th century, early 20th century, that picked up on these ideas, especially the whole idea of just think of H.P. Lovecraft with the Cthulhu mythos, the mountains of madness. The explorers, the human explorers, go up there and they find a civilization that's unbelievably old and it's monstrous and it's extraterrestrial. This is where this stuff comes from. But again, you wouldn't know that watching the History Channel with Ancient Aliens. They're going to make it sound like it's real, but it's not. It's just made up mythology in different eras. Now, Blavatsky wrote, "Who are the lords of the moon? In India, they are called Pitris, or lunar ancestors. But in the Hebrew scrolls, it's Jehovah himself who is Lord of the moon, collectively as the host and also one of the Elohim." So look at this paragraph. She equates the God of the Bible with an extraterrestrial, Lord of the moon, and the heavenly host, again, Yahweh, the God of the Bible, Jehovah, is just one of these other Elohim, one of these extraterrestrials out there, who were in control of the moon and who birthed, created, evolved into the extraterrestrials who live on the moon that then ultimately come down to Earth and settle it. Again, this is pure ancient astronaut science fiction kind of stuff, and it comes from the late 19th century, Theosophy. Root races. Again, a little bit of a summary. Humanity ultimately descended from space gods. And, well, let's just throw this element in. When it comes to Atlantis or the Atlanteans, of course, Atlantis is lost in a great flood. I mean, we all know about Atlantis. But Blavatsky had the earliest Atlanteans as giants. But does that sound familiar? Giants that get wiped out in the flood. Nephilim, Genesis 6. The surviving Atlanteans overlap with the emerging fifth root race, the Aryans, after the flood. So you have giants after the flood who are enlightened beings. Men of renown, Genesis 6:4. Again, are you getting the feeling here? And of course, they transmit their knowledge to the Aryans. Again, it makes them heroic. It makes them good guys. So this is Theosophy. Again, you can see if you've watched the earlier video where there's strands of Gnosticism in Theosophy, there's strands of Gnosticism and Theosophy in ancient astronaut thinking. And again, of course, science fiction. And that's what the podcast is about, to discuss all these sorts of elements. So Theosophy is about the imagined evolutionary journey of humanity aided by advanced creatures from other planets. They are the answer to our problems. We need to go back to them and reinvent ourselves. Jason Colavito, an excellent book on Theosophy and ancient astronauts, says Theosophy traces man's evolution through countless ages and many worlds. And that evolution is guided by elder brothers. Again, they're good guys. Okay, they're here to help us. The elder brothers take an interest in us and impart some of their wonderful knowledge to those who earnestly seek it. This is the message of UFO contactee literature, right here in a paragraph. And it comes right out of Theosophy. The beings of each planet, said Blavatsky, whether Earth beings, Martians, Venusians, or whatever, pass on together from globe to globe of their own planetary chain in an extremely slow and gradual, but nevertheless definite and cyclic process of inner unfoldment and advancement. Sounds like Gnosticism, doesn't it? Over the course of billions of years. And that's right from her Secret Doctrine, one of her most important books. So this is, again, what you're dealing with Gnosticism and now Theosophy.